Margaret Hensley didn't knock. She never knocked. She pushed the door open like she owned every board and nail in that cabin, and the first thing she did was look at Lydia. Not at the babies, not at the room, not at her son-in-law standing 3 feet away with flowers still on his hands. She looked straight at Lydia and said, cold as January iron, "Get your things. You're done here." Lydia didn't move. Margaret took one step closer. "My grandchildren will not be raised by a woman nobody sent for." The twins were in the next room. You could hear them breathing in the silence. And Gideon Ashcroft, a man who hadn't said 10 unnecessary words since his wife died, put down the bowl he was holding and said quietly, like he'd already decided, "She stays, Margaret. If that were you, if everything you'd built in 3 months could be ripped away in 30 seconds by someone who never once picked up a crying child at 2 in the morning, what would you do?" Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and tell me your city, your country. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, leave a like. It takes 1 second and it means everything. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The storm came from the northwest, the way the worst ones always did in that part of Wyoming, and it came fast. Lydia Rowan had been watching the sky for 2 hours before she finally accepted that she wasn't going to outrun it. Her horse was already limping on the left foreleg, had been since that morning when she'd pushed him too hard across a frozen creek bed, and the bedroll tied behind the saddle was soaked through from the sleet that had started just after noon. She had $11, a canvas bag with 3 days of food left in it, and no particular destination. That last part was the thing she tried hardest not to think about. She was 34 years old, and she had nowhere to go. That sentence had a weight to it that she carried differently on different days. Some days it felt almost manageable, like a stone she'd learned to hold without showing it. Today, with the temperature dropping and her horse favoring that leg and the sky turning the particular shade of gray that meant serious business, it felt like a millstone. She saw the fence line first, then the smoke, thin and gray, bending sideways in the wind. Then the shape of buildings, a main cabin, what looked like a barn, a smaller structure she couldn't identify yet. No lights in the windows, which surprised her. It was nearly 4 o'clock and the light was already failing fast. She almost kept riding. That was the thing she would think about later, how close she came to just pulling the collar of her coat tighter and pushing on toward nothing in particular. But her horse made a sound then, low and tired, and she felt the uneven hitch in his gait under her, and she thought, he's done. And if I'm being honest, so am I. She turned toward the smoke. The man who answered the door looked like he hadn't slept in 3 weeks. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been handsome under different circumstances. Good jaw, steady eyes, the sort of build that suggested he'd spent his whole life doing physical work and didn't think much about it either way. But his shirt was buttoned wrong, 2 buttons off, so the collar sat crooked against his neck, and he was holding an infant. And from somewhere behind him came the sound of a second infant, fussing in rising, urgent cycles. He stared at her. She stared at him. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said. "My horse is lame and the storm's coming. I just need somewhere to wait it out. 1 night. I'll be gone before you even wake up." He said nothing for a moment. His eyes went past her to the horse, then to the sky, then back to her face. Whatever he was calculating, it took longer than she expected. 1 night, he said finally. It wasn't a question. It wasn't exactly an agreement either. It was just the only 2 words that came out. 1 night, she confirmed. He stepped back from the door and let her in. The inside of that cabin hit her like a wave, and not entirely in a bad way. It was warm, genuinely, deeply warm. The kind of warmth that makes your fingers ache when you've been cold too long. But the warmth was the only thing that was working right. She could see that within 30 seconds. There was a cradle near the fire with one of the babies in it, and it was positioned too close, not dangerously close, not fire close, but close enough that the heat was uneven, too much on one side and not enough on the other. The second baby was the one the man was carrying, and he carried it the way a person carries something fragile that they're terrified of dropping, with both arms stiff and the baby held out slightly from his chest like he wasn't sure of the angle. The kitchen area, she used the word loosely. It was really just the far end of the same room, had 3 different pots on the stove and a smell coming off all of them that suggested at least one had been sitting too long. There was laundry draped over a chair to dry, but the chair was positioned wrong relative to the heat, and the clothes were still damp. She could see a crack in the chinking between 2 logs on the north wall that was letting a thin, cold finger of outside air into the room. Not enough to be dangerous tonight. Enough to be a serious problem come January. She took all of this in and said nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to get thrown out of someone's home was to walk in and immediately explain everything they were doing wrong. "What are their names?" she asked instead. He looked at her like the question surprised him. "The babies?" "Yes." He shifted the one in his arms. "Clara. And the one in the cradle is James." "How old?" 4 months. She nodded. "They sleep at the same time?" "No," he said, and something in the way he said it, just the flatness of it, the exhaustion behind one syllable, told her everything about what the last 4 months had looked like. "I'm Lydia Rowan," she said. "Gideon Ashcroft." "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, "I can hold one of them while you see to the other. If you'd like. I'm good with babies." He hesitated. She watched the hesitation move across his face, not distrust exactly, more like a man who had learned that accepting help always came with something attached, and he was too tired to figure out what the attachment was this time. But Clara was already starting to fuss, and James was already fussing, and Gideon had only 2 arms. He handed Clara to her. It took Lydia about 3 minutes to understand that the man was running on nothing. Not just tired, she knew tired, but the specific, hollow-eyed depletion of someone who had not had an uninterrupted thought in months. He moved through the cabin with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had memorized a routine and was executing it without actually being present for any of it. He didn't eat while she watched. He didn't sit. He just moved from baby to pot to window to baby again, like a man in a loop he didn't remember entering. She found out about the wife by accident. She asked where the baby quilts were kept. Clara was only wrapped in a single thin blanket. And he went very still for just a moment, the way people do when something unexpected catches them exactly where they're most bruised. And then he said, "Top of the chest. Ruth made them before." He stopped. "Top of the chest." Ruth. Lydia got the quilts herself. She didn't ask any follow-up questions. The storm hit properly around 7 that evening, and the wind came up hard enough to make the cabin walls groan. Gideon put another log on the fire and stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at nothing, his hands behind his back, his shoulders carrying something that wasn't just the weight of the cold coming through the glass. "Your nearest neighbor," Lydia said. "How far?" 4 miles east." "And they know about the twins?" "They know." She waited to see if he'd say anything else. He didn't. "Do they help?" He turned from the window, not defensive, just direct. "People have their own lives, Mrs. Rowan." She accepted that. It was true. It was also a particular kind of loneliness, the kind where you tell yourself other people's absence is reasonable, so you don't have to feel the full weight of being alone. James started crying at that moment, not the hungry cry, but the sharp, sudden cry that meant something hurt. Gideon moved toward him immediately, but Lydia was closer, and she reached the cradle first, and when she picked him up, she felt immediately that his left ear was pulled toward his shoulder in the way babies do when an ear is bothering them. "He's had this before?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "Pulling at his ear?" Gideon's face changed. "He's been fussier this week. I thought, it might be nothing," she said, "but you want to watch it. If he gets a fever tonight, I don't have a doctor within 20 miles. I know. I'm just telling you what to watch for." She said it matter-of-factly, not like she was trying to frighten him. She could see it landed anyway. He looked at his son with an expression that was almost too raw to watch, the expression of a man who understood, clearly and completely, that he was the only thing standing between these 2 small lives and everything that could go wrong, and that he wasn't sure he was enough. Lydia kept that observation to herself, too. She meant to sleep in the barn. That had been her plan. One night in the barn, out of the wind, gone before dawn. But the storm made that impossible. By 9 o'clock, the wind was driving snow horizontal. and when Gideon opened the door to check on the livestock, the force of it knocked the door back into his arm hard enough to make him swear under his breath. "Barn is 30 feet," he said when he turned around and found her already standing. "I heard. You can have the, He stopped, started again. "There's a cot in the back room. Storage mostly. It's fine." She understood without him having to finish that sentence either. The back room was where his wife had kept things. She could see it in the way he said mostly, like he was apologizing for something he hadn't done on purpose. "The cot is more than enough," she said. "Thank you." She was asleep within 10 minutes of lying down, which told her more about how depleted she herself had been than she liked to admit. She'd been on the road for 6 weeks since leaving the life she'd had in Colorado, the house that wasn't really hers anymore, the town that had made its feelings clear about a widow with no family and no money and no particular standing. She hadn't realized how tired she was because she hadn't let herself stop long enough to find out. She woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of one of the twins crying and lay still for a moment, listening, and then heard Gideon's footsteps on the floor. She listened to him move. She listened to the cry shift and eventually quiet. She listened to him sit down, she could tell from the particular creak of the chair by the fire, and not get back up. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she'd seen in this cabin in the last 6 hours. The man was not careless. That was the first thing she'd had to correct in her initial assessment. He was not neglectful or stupid or indifferent. He was a man doing his absolute best under circumstances that would have broken most people. With no instruction and no support and grief, he was too busy to process sitting on his chest like a stone. But his best was not going to be enough. Not with that crack in the north wall, not with the food storage she'd glimpsed when she'd opened the wrong cabinet, provisions that were poorly organized and likely to spoil before February, not with the cradle positioned wrong and the sleeping arrangement that meant neither baby ever got a full sleep cycle, not with the coming winter, which, if the sky she'd read for the last 2 days meant what she thought it meant, was going to be something beyond ordinary. She was not a woman who made decisions lightly. She had learned that lesson the hard way, learned it in a 2-room house in Colorado with a husband who drank and a bank that didn't care and a community that watched and did nothing and called it privacy. She had survived that and come out the other side with a precise, unsentimental understanding of what things actually cost and what they were actually worth. She turned the idea over in her mind carefully, not rashly, not with any particular feeling attached to it yet, just logically. She had nowhere to go. He needed something that he didn't know how to name yet. The babies needed to survive the winter. One night, she had said, in the dark and quiet of the storage room, with the storm hammering the walls outside, she thought, maybe I was wrong about that. She brought it up at breakfast. She'd been up since 5. She was always up at 5, had been since childhood. It was just the way she was made, and she'd used the time carefully. She'd mixed a better feeding solution for James, who was clearly not tolerating the current one well. She'd moved Claire's cradle 8 inches away from the fire and turned it slightly so the warmth distributed more evenly. She'd looked at the food stores properly and made a mental inventory she didn't write down because she didn't have paper handy but didn't need to. When Gideon came out of the back room where he'd finally fallen asleep in the chair, she'd heard him stop moving around 3. He found her at the stove with both babies quiet in their cradle, which was not a thing that apparently happened often, judging by the look on his face when he came through the door. He stopped. He looked at the babies. He looked at her. He said, "How did you—" "Fed James a little differently," she said. "He's been getting too much at once. Small amounts more often might help with the fussiness." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Sit down, Mr. Ashcroft. I want to ask you something." He sat. He looked at the coffee, then at her, with the wariness of a man who had learned that when people said, "I want to ask you something," they usually wanted something they expected him to refuse. "I have nowhere to be," she said. "That's the honest truth of it. I'm not running from anything legal," she added, because she'd learned that was always the first thing people wondered. "My husband died 2 years ago. The house went to debt. I've been working where I could find work, and I've been moving, and I'm tired of moving." She paused. "You need help. I can see it. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm saying it because it's a fact, same as the weather. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read him easily, which she respected. She didn't trust men she could read too easily. "What exactly are you offering?" he said. "Help with the babies. Help with the house. I know food storage. I know cold weather preparation. I know—" She stopped herself before she said, "I know you're not going to make it through February the way things are right now," because that was true, but it wasn't useful yet. "I'll work for room and board, nothing more. When spring comes, if you want me gone, I'll go." The silence stretched. Outside, the storm was still going, but softer now, the first storm of what would be many. She could feel that in the air. "You don't know me," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't know you." "That's also true." He looked at his hands for a moment, then at the babies, then out the window at the white-covered world. Then he said, "Until spring." She nodded once. "You try to tell me how to run this ranch," he said, "and we'll have a problem." She almost said, "You're already running it into the ground." She said, "Fair enough." What she didn't tell him, what she kept entirely to herself as she turned back to the stove, and he sat there with his coffee and his sleeping children and his enormous exhausted relief, was that she'd already seen enough to know that this winter was going to test him in ways he couldn't imagine yet, and that she had no intention of watching it happen without doing something about it. She was not a woman who let things she could fix stay broken. That quality had cost her in her life. She knew that. She was about to find out whether it would cost her here too. The first week, Gideon watched her the way a man watches something he doesn't quite trust, but can't find specific fault with either. He'd come into a room, and his eyes would go immediately to whatever she was doing, and she could feel the assessment in it. Not hostile, just careful. She understood it. She was a stranger in his house, touching things that belonged to his life, and the fact that he'd agreed to it in a moment of exhausted desperation didn't mean he'd stopped having doubts. She didn't try to make him comfortable with her. That had been a mistake she'd made before, in other situations. Working too hard to be liked, softening her edges until she'd softened the useful parts of herself too. She just worked. She was up before him every morning, and she did what needed doing, and she didn't make conversation unless he started it. He started it on the fourth day. She was in the process of moving the food stores around, reorganizing the root cellar in a way that put the things most likely to spoil in front and the longer-lasting provisions in back, with the dried goods elevated off the floor on board she'd found in the barn. And she heard him on the stairs and braced herself slightly, because she knew this was the part where it would either go badly or not. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at what she'd done and said, "Ruth had a system." "I know," Lydia said. "I can see it. I kept the same categories, just changed the order." He looked at it for another moment. "She put the potatoes there. The potatoes were going to freeze there. The cold comes through the foundation on that wall. They need to be in the center." She said it evenly, no apology in it, because she wasn't sorry. She was right. "I moved them 6 feet. They're still potatoes." He was quiet. Then, she didn't know about the foundation. She might not have had a winter here yet to find out. Something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, more like a small piece of the armor coming loose without him meaning it to. "She died in March," he said. "They were born in November. She had 4 months with them." Lydia stopped what she was doing. She didn't turn around to look at him because she understood instinctively that he wasn't saying this to her so much as saying it to the room, to the space where it had been sitting unsaid. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it simply, without decoration. "She would have known what to do," he said. "With them. She always—" He stopped. "You're doing fine with them," Lydia said. "Don't," he said. She turned then. He wasn't angry. He was just exact. "Don't say that when it isn't true. I know what I'm doing wrong. I just don't always know how to fix it." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "All right. Do you want me to tell you what I see?" A pause. "Yeah," he said. "I think I do." So she told him. Not everything at once. She wasn't cruel, but the main things, the cradle placement, the feeding schedule for James, The way Clara needed to be burped differently than James because they were not the same baby and didn't respond to the same handling, which seemed obvious once you said it but wasn't, when you were doing everything alone at 3 in the morning. The crack in the north wall that needed to be re-chinked before December. The roof overhang on the south side that was going to let ice build up in a way that would cause problems. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which told her something about him. Men who were afraid of being wrong interrupted. Men who were afraid of looking weak got defensive before you finished the sentence. Gideon Ashcroft just listened, and when she was done, he said, "The chinking. I can do that this week if the weather holds." "Good," she said. "The roof overhang I'll need to think about." "You have time on the roof. Not much, but some." "What's the most urgent thing?" She didn't hesitate. "James's ear. I want you to watch him today. If he pulls at it more than 3 times in an hour, we need to talk about getting him to a doctor, whether or not." That got him. She could see it, the particular tightening around his eyes when something hit close. 20 miles, he said. "I know. I'm not saying it'll come to that. I'm saying watch him." He watched him. They both watched him. And James, apparently deciding that he'd caused enough concern for 1 week, improved by afternoon. Less fussing, less ear-pulling, better feeding. By evening, he was sleeping in the way babies sometimes sleep when they've finally gotten comfortable, deeply, heavily, arms thrown wide like they're surrendering to it. Gideon stood over the cradle at 9 o'clock and looked at his son and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere lower than his lungs. "He's okay," Lydia said from across the room. "Yeah," Gideon said. He didn't move for another minute, then, "Thank you for watching him today." "That's what I'm here for." He turned then and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a man recalibrating something he'd already decided, and not being entirely sure how he felt about having to do it. He went to bed without saying anything else. She sat with the fire for another hour, and listened to the wind, and thought that this arrangement was stranger than she'd expected, and harder to define and probably more fragile than it looked. She was not wrong about any of those things. The neighbors started coming by the second week, and that was when things got complicated. The first one was a man named Caleb Mercer, who ran the largest ranch in the valley and seemed to have decided that this gave him a particular authority over everything in it. He was maybe 50, broad across the shoulders, with a way of taking up space in a room that suggested he'd spent a long time being the biggest thing in most rooms he entered. He came ostensibly to check on Gideon and the twins. He spent approximately 4 minutes with the twins and the rest of the visit looking at Lydia like she was a piece of furniture that had appeared without explanation. "Where'd she come from?" he said to Gideon while Lydia was standing 6 feet away. "She was passing through. She's staying on to help with the babies and the ranch." Caleb made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Passing through to where?" "That's her business," Gideon said. Caleb looked at Lydia directly then. "You know ranching?" "Some," she said. "What kind of some?" "The kind that comes from doing it," she said pleasantly. He didn't like that. She could see it, the small tightening at the corners of his mouth, the way his chin came up slightly. Men like Caleb Mercer were not accustomed to women who answered questions with questions of the same weight. "Gideon," he said, still looking at her, "you need anything. You know where I am." "I know," Gideon said. "Thanks for coming by." After he left, Gideon didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. But she noticed that he'd said that's her business without being asked to, and she filed that away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. The second visitor was a woman named Dora Finch, who was kind in the way that people are kind when they're also deeply curious and don't know how to separate the two impulses. She brought a pie, a good pie. Lydia could tell from the smell, and she held Clara for 20 minutes and told Lydia 3 separate times that it was so wonderful that Gideon had found someone to help in a tone that put a particular weight on the word found, as though finding someone implied a specific kind of looking. Lydia just smiled and offered more coffee and didn't explain herself because she'd learned that explaining yourself to people who'd already decided what they thought was mostly a waste of breath. But Dora said something before she left that stayed with Lydia. She was putting on her coat and she looked around the cabin and said, Almost to herself, Ruth had such a way with this place. You can still feel it, in the little things. And Lydia looked around the cabin and thought, yes, you can. She thought about that at night sometimes, in the storage room that was becoming less strange to her with each passing week. She was not trying to erase Ruth Ashcroft. She was not trying to replace her. She was trying to keep 2 babies alive through a Wyoming winter and stop a man from quietly drowning in his own grief and inertia, and those goals were completely separate from whatever Ruth had been in this house. The trouble was that nobody from the outside could see the difference. It was the hay insulation idea that first got her seriously mocked. It happened at the feed store in town, 3 weeks into her staying at Iron Hollow. Gideon had taken her along because she'd asked to see what supplies were available before she made recommendations, which he'd agreed to with the pragmatic acceptance he'd started applying to most of her suggestions. Not enthusiastic, not resistant, just, all right, if it matters to you. The feed store had 4 other men in it when they arrived. She knew the type. Not bad men necessarily, just men who had a settled idea of how things worked and experienced anything outside that idea as vaguely threatening. They watched her move through the store the way people watch something unfamiliar. Not hostile yet, just watchful. It went sideways when she mentioned the hay walls. She'd been explaining it to Gideon, quietly, near the back of the store. How packing insulated hay bales against the north and west exterior walls of the barn, held in place with a simple frame, would significantly reduce heat loss and cut down on the feed needed to keep the cattle warm through deep cold. It wasn't a new idea. She'd seen it work. She'd done it herself once in a different life, in a different state. Hay walls, said Caleb Mercer, who had apparently been standing 2 aisles over and had not felt any obligation to pretend he wasn't listening. He said it the way you'd say pink elephants, like the words themselves were the joke. The other men in the store glanced over. For insulation, Lydia said without raising her voice. Against the exterior walls. Reduces heat loss by... I've ranched this valley for 22 years, Caleb said, walking toward them now, unhurried, like he was just making conversation. Never heard of anyone insulating with hay walls. That doesn't mean it doesn't work, she said. It means nobody who knows what they're doing uses it. She looked at him directly. Or it means nobody thought to try it. One of the other men, younger, maybe 30, clearly enjoying this, made a sound that was encouragement for Caleb. Caleb smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. Gideon, he said, shifting his attention, you're taking her advice on your barn? Gideon was quiet for a moment. Lydia kept her eyes on Caleb and waited. I'm considering it, Gideon said. I'd consider it carefully, Caleb said. That's all I'll say. They left the feed store and walked to the wagon, and Gideon helped her up without a word, and they were halfway back down the main road before he said, Is it going to work? She thought about it honestly, which she always tried to do, even when honesty was inconvenient. I think so. I've seen it work in Montana. The principle is sound. But I can't promise you the exact result because every building is different. That's not a ringing endorsement, he said. No, she agreed. It's an honest one. He drove for another half-mile. Then, we'll try it on the small barn first, see what happens. She nodded. She didn't say thank you because it wasn't a favor. It was a practical decision, and she didn't want to muddy that. But she noticed he hadn't deferred to Caleb. She noticed that too. The mistake she made was with the rye flour, and she made it in front of Gideon, which was worse than making it privately. She'd been stretching the baking supplies, trying to make the white flour last longer by mixing in rye, which she'd used successfully before, and she'd misjudged the ratio. Or maybe this particular rye was heavier than she'd worked with before because the bread came out dense and wrong, textured in a way that was still edible but was not good. She knew it the moment she cut into it. There was a particular sound a good loaf made, and this was not that sound. Gideon was at the table when she set it down. He looked at it. She looked at it. I got the ratio wrong, she said. It's fine. It isn't fine, it's just edible. I'll adjust it tomorrow. She sat down across from him. I should have tested a smaller amount first. That was careless. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one where she'd done something he didn't expect, and he was filing it away somewhere. Most people don't just say when they're wrong, he said. Most people waste a lot of time that way, she said. He ate the bread without complaint. She adjusted the ratio the next day and the loaf came out right, and he didn't say anything about either one, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. That was the rhythm of it, those first weeks. She made mistakes. She acknowledged them and corrected them. He watched this happen with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and she had the sense that it was recalibrating something in his assessment of her, slowly, reluctantly, honestly. The same way the ranch itself was recalibrating, incrementally, as the things she fixed stayed fixed and the improvements she made held. James stopped fussing. His ear cleared up without a doctor. Claire started sleeping in 4-hour stretches, which meant Gideon started sleeping in 4-hour stretches, which meant he stopped looking like a man who was actively dying of exhaustion. The cattle went into the small barn and the hay walls went up around the exterior, and within a week the temperature inside was measurably warmer, which Gideon confirmed by touching the water trough that had been icing overnightly and finding it still liquid at 6 in the morning. He came inside and told her that, and she said, "Good," and kept stirring the oatmeal. "You could say I told you so," he said. "I could," she agreed, "but then you'd stop telling me when things work, and I need to know that as much as when they don't." He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, and then he sat down and she put a bowl in front of him, and that was that. It was Clara who broke something open in her that she hadn't meant to let be broken. It happened on a Tuesday, ordinary as anything else. Lydia was holding Clara after a feeding, doing the walking and patting that helped Clara settle, and the baby did the thing babies sometimes do. She grabbed a fistful of Lydia's collar with her whole tiny hand and turned her face in and just rested there, completely trusting. No reason for it beyond the warmth and the familiar smell and whatever animal knowledge infants have about safety. Lydia stood in the middle of that cabin and felt something move through her chest that she hadn't felt in years. She'd lost a baby once. Between the marriage she'd had and the life she'd tried to build out of it, there had been a baby who'd lived for 2 days and then hadn't. She didn't think about it most of the time. She'd learned how to put it in a room in herself and close the door, because the alternative was not surviving, and she'd needed to survive. But Clara's weight in her arms and the particular trust of that small fist in her collar, that door opened a crack, and she stood there and let it, just for a moment, just in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. She sat down carefully in the chair by the fire. She held the baby, and she looked at the fire, and she thought, "This is dangerous." Not in a physical sense, in the specific sense of a woman who'd learned to travel light through her life, attaching herself to things that weren't hers to keep. She thought about it for 3 days, about whether she should go, whether the practical value she was providing was worth the cost of what she was beginning to. She stopped that thought. She was good at stopping thoughts, but the thought had a way of being there in the morning anyway. The first real confrontation with Gideon happened over the sleeping arrangements for the twins, and it was ugly in the specific, quiet way that things are ugly when two exhausted people are arguing about something that is partly about the thing and partly about everything else. She'd suggested, carefully, she thought she'd been careful, that moving the twins into their own shared sleeping space, separated from the main room by a curtain rather than completely isolated, would help both of them sleep longer. She'd even made a case for it, explaining how the noise of the main room kept resetting their sleep cycles. Gideon said no. She pushed gently. He said no again, harder. She made the mistake of saying, "Ruth's cradle placement," and stopped, because she saw his face. "Don't," he said, and it was the same word he'd used before, but with more weight in it now. "Don't use her name to make a point about something she's not here to agree or disagree with. I wasn't trying to eat. I know what you were trying to do. You were right about the food storage and right about the hay walls and probably right about this too. And I'm telling you no, not because you're wrong, because I'm not ready." She looked at him. He looked back at her and she could see it, the particular complicated grief of a man who knew logically that things needed to change and felt emotionally that changing them was a betrayal of something he couldn't let go of yet. "All right," she said. "That's it? All right. You're not ready. All right. I'll wait." He looked at her like he was trying to find the manipulation in it. She let him look. "You're infuriating," he said finally, but it was not exactly the same as anger. "I know," she said. 3 days later, he moved the cradles himself, in the middle of an afternoon when she was outside checking the hay walls. He didn't say anything about it. She came in and saw it and didn't say anything about it either. But Clara and James slept 6 hours straight that night. And in the morning, Gideon came out of the back room looking like a different man. Not new, not unbroken, just slightly less depleted. And he poured himself coffee and said, "The curtain works better than I thought it would." "Good," she said, and handed him the oatmeal. The ranch was running differently. She could feel it, and she knew he could feel it too. The particular difference between a house where everything is done reactively, in response to crisis, and a house where things are done ahead of time, in anticipation. It was not a smooth or graceful transformation. There were days where nothing went right, and she questioned the rye flour or the hay walls or her own judgment about what this place needed. There were days when Gideon was unreachable inside his grief, and the whole atmosphere of the cabin was heavy and close in a way that made her want to walk until the cold cleared it. There were days when Clara screamed for 4 hours straight, and James joined in at hour 3, and nobody had any answers. But underneath the bad days, something was holding. The food wasn't spoiling. The cattle were warmer. The twins were growing, actually growing, in a way she could measure by the way their sleepers fit. And Gideon Ashcroft, who had opened his door to her 6 weeks ago, looking like a man made entirely of exhaustion and unprocessed loss, was beginning to look, incrementally, like something else. Not healed. She wasn't naive enough to think that. Not whole, but present. That was the word. He was beginning to be present in his own life again, and she'd watched it happen one small thing at a time, and she didn't let herself think about what that meant for her, or what it meant that she'd started paying attention to whether he smiled at breakfast or why it mattered to her when he did. She didn't let herself think about any of that. She had learned to be very, very good at not thinking about certain things. The trouble was, the winter hadn't really started yet, and what she'd been reading in the sky for the last week, the specific color of the clouds at morning, the way the cattle were behaving, the quality of the cold itself, which had a particular depth to it that she'd only felt once before in her life, was telling her something that she hadn't yet found the right moment to say out loud. It was telling her that what they'd done so far wasn't going to be enough. That the preparations they'd made, as good as they were preparations for a normal winter, and that what was coming was not a normal winter. She stood at the window the night of the first hard frost and looked at the sky and felt the particular dread of someone who can see something coming that nobody else has noticed yet, and knew that the moment she said it out loud, the argument it would start was going to be the hardest one she'd had yet. She waited 3 days before saying anything about the sky. That was not hesitation. She was not a woman who hesitated when something mattered. It was calculation. She needed to be sure enough that when she said it out loud and Gideon looked at her the way he was going to look at her, she could hold her ground without flinching, because she knew how it was going to land. She'd seen the same thing happen in Montana years ago when she told her neighbor that the creek was going to flood before anyone else thought it would, and the neighbor had smiled politely and lost his lower field and half his fence line 3 days later. Being right ahead of time had a particular cost that being right after the fact didn't, and she'd paid that cost enough times to know the shape of it. She picked the morning after the second hard frost, when Gideon was in a reasonable mood. Not good, she'd learned not to wait for good, but reasonable. And the babies were both quiet and the coffee was hot, and she sat down across from him and said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something about this winter." He looked up from his cup. The way she said it made him set the cup down. "I think it's going to be bad," she said. "Not normal bad. Something beyond what this valley's seen in a long time." He was quiet for a moment. "What makes you say that?" She told him what she'd been observing. The sky color in the mornings, a particular flat gray with a yellow undertone that she'd only seen once before, in 1887, the winter that had killed half the cattle in 3 counties in Montana. The behavior of the horses, who'd been restless and herd pressing in a way that wasn't normal autumn anxiety. The cold itself, which had arrived 2 weeks early and had a quality to it she could only describe as deep, not the surface cold of early season, but the kind that came from somewhere far north and didn't intend to leave. The fact that the creek had iced at the edges in October, which she'd been told by Dora Finch had never happened before November in all the years Dora had been in the valley. Gideon listened to all of it. He had the same quality he'd had when she'd told him about the cabin problems. He listened completely, without defending against what she was saying. Then he said, That's a lot of inference from weather signs. Yes, she said, it is. Experienced ranchers in this valley, men who've been here 30 years, they're not saying anything about an unusual winter. I know. Caleb Mercer has been ranching here since before I was born. He's not. Caleb Mercer, she said, as evenly as she could manage, was also the man who told you hay walls were foolish. The silence that followed that was not comfortable. She hadn't meant it as a point scored. She'd meant it as a simple fact. But she could see Gideon turning it over, and she could see the conflict in it, because he respected Caleb, had grown up respecting Caleb, and there was something in being asked to trust a woman he'd known for 6 weeks over a man he'd known his whole life that pulled against something deep in him. What are you asking me to do? He said. More than we planned. More feed reserves, more hay. The guide ropes between buildings, I want to string them now, not later. The nursery insulation needs to be better, significantly better. And the livestock shelter needs, that's a lot of work and a lot of money, he said. It wasn't a refusal. It was a man doing arithmetic in his head. Yes, she said, it is. And if you're wrong? She looked at him steadily. Then we have more feed than we need and some extra rope and a very warm nursery, and you can remind me about it all spring. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire popped. From behind the curtain, one of the twins made a soft sound and then went quiet again. Let me think about it, he said. Don't think too long, she said. That's the only thing I'll say. He thought about it for 2 days, which she accepted because 2 days was not too long, and she could see he was actually thinking, rather than just delaying. He went out and walked the property. He checked the creek himself. He stood in the barn for a long time one afternoon, and she watched him from the window without him knowing she was watching, and she could see him looking at the sky with the particular attention of a man trying to read something he wasn't sure he had the language for. On the 3rd morning, he came in from the barn and said, "Tell me exactly what you need and in what order." She already had the list in her head. She'd made it 3 days ago. They worked. That was the simplest way to say it, and the truest. They worked in a way that Lydia hadn't worked alongside anyone since her husband was still alive and functional in the early years before the drinking got bad. The specific rhythm of 2 people doing physical labor in parallel, where you start to anticipate the other person's movements and adjust your own without talking about it. Gideon was strong in the direct, efficient way of men who'd done hard physical work their whole lives, and he didn't waste motion, and he didn't complain. And on the days when something didn't work the first time, he just tried it a different way. She caught herself noticing that, the not complaining. She caught herself noticing other things too, and tried to be disciplined about it. But discipline had its limits when you were working in close quarters with someone from before dawn until after dark. The guide ropes went up first. Heavy rope, good rope, strung tight between the cabin and the barn, and the smaller outbuilding and the feed storage, at a height that a person could grab in 0 visibility. Gideon's first reaction, when she explained the spacing, was, "That feels excessive." In a whiteout, she said, "You can't see your own hand. You can be 6 feet from the barn door and walk past it and freeze to death in your own yard." He said nothing. He helped her string the ropes. The nursery insulation was her own project, and she took it seriously in the way she took seriously the things that had no margin for being wrong. She used every scrap of material she could find. Extra wool, salvaged fabric, hay packed between the inner and outer walls of the corner where the babies slept. A heavy curtain hung at an angle that blocked cold air movement without blocking heat from the main room. It looked strange. She knew it looked strange. She knew exactly what it would look like to someone walking in and seeing it, like something a person did when they were worried and didn't quite know what they were doing. But she knew what she was doing. The strangeness was just the cost of it working. Gideon looked at it when she was done. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she waited. "It looks like a—" He stopped. "A hay fort," she said. "I know." "I was going to say a very serious hay fort." Something surprised her then. She almost laughed. It came up before she could think about it, and she caught it, but not fast enough, and he saw it. And something in his face shifted in the way it did when she did something he didn't expect. "It'll work," she said, getting back to herself. "I know it'll work," he said quietly. "That's not what I was thinking about." She didn't ask what he was thinking about. She picked up her tools and went back to work. Hold up. Margaret Hensley arrived on a Thursday with no warning and in a hired wagon, which meant she'd planned it. You didn't hire a wagon in November without planning it, and she brought 2 bags that suggested she intended to stay. Lydia heard the wagon and looked out the window and felt the specific drop in her stomach that came with recognizing a threat she'd been vaguely expecting but hadn't wanted to think about directly. She knew about Margaret because Dora Finch had mentioned her, carefully, over coffee 3 weeks earlier. Ruth's mother, Dora had said, with the particular careful tone of someone giving you information they think you need while also conveying that the information is not simple. She lives in Cheyenne. She's been asking about the babies. Dora had looked at Lydia directly then. She was very close with Ruth. Lydia had understood what Dora meant and had filed it in the same place she filed things she needed to know but couldn't do anything about yet. Now Margaret was climbing down from the wagon and Gideon was coming out of the barn, and Lydia watched the reunion through the window. Margaret embraced him. She was a tall woman, straight-backed, maybe 60, with white hair pinned precisely. The embrace was real. She could see that. Whatever else Margaret was, she had genuinely loved her daughter and genuinely loved her son-in-law, and the grief in the way she held him for a moment before stepping back was not performed. Then Margaret looked at the cabin. And even from inside, through the glass, Lydia could see the exact moment Margaret noticed the guide ropes. She came inside with the particular composure of a woman who had decided what she thought before she arrived. She looked at the cabin, at the rearranged furniture, the curtain across the nursery corner, the reorganized shelves, the hay insulation that was visible at the edges of the wall where Lydia hadn't been able to make it look tidy, and her face did something complicated and brief that she controlled quickly. "Mrs. Rowan," she said when Gideon introduced them. "Mrs. Hensley," Lydia said. "Can I get you something? Coffee or—" "In a moment." Margaret looked at the nursery corner. "May I see my grandchildren?" "Of course." Margaret went to the babies, and for a few minutes everything was the truest version of what it was. A grandmother seeing her daughter's children, touching their faces, talking to them in the soft voice people use for infants, and the grief and love in it were real and large. And Lydia felt them from across the room and stood quietly and let them be what they were. Then Margaret stood up and turned around. "Gideon," she said, "I'd like to speak with you privately." Lydia said, "I'll check on the horses," and went outside before anyone had to ask her to. She did not particularly want to check on the horses. She stood in the cold with her hands in her pockets and looked at the guide ropes running between the buildings and the sky above them, which was doing something she didn't like. A particular kind of settling, a flat, purposeful lowering that she associated with the sky, getting ready to do something serious. She stood there for 15 minutes and thought about what was happening inside the cabin and made herself not try to hear it through the walls, which she could have done if she'd gone around to the side. When she came back in, Gideon was alone. He was standing by the window. He didn't turn around when she came in. "She wants to take the twins to Cheyenne," he said, "until spring. She says they'd be better cared for there, more—" He paused. "More stably situated." Lydia took off her coat. She hung it on the hook by the door. She said, "What do you want to do?" He turned then. "She also asked about you." "I assumed she would." "She asked why I needed a woman I didn't know living in my house." "That's a fair question," Lydia said. "I told her you were working for room and board and that you'd helped considerably with the ranch and the babies." He paused again. She asked if that was all. The room was very quiet. "What did you say?" Lydia asked. "I said that was all." He looked at her steadily. She didn't believe me. "Did she say that?" "She didn't have to." Lydia nodded once and went to the stove to check the pot she'd left simmering. She kept her back to him because she needed a moment to arrange her face before she turned around, and she was not going to apologize for needing that. "I'm not going to let her take the twins," Gideon said. "They're mine. They belong here." "She loves them," Lydia said, keeping her voice even. "I know that. It doesn't change what I said." She turned around. "She's grieving her daughter. The way the cabin looks right now, all the changes, for her that probably looks like erasure, like someone coming in and I know what it looks like. I'm saying maybe be patient with her, not because she's right, because she's in pain." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read cleanly. "Why are you defending her? She just tried to take your... He stopped. She waited to see if he'd finish that sentence. He didn't. She's going to be harder on you than on anyone else in this situation, he said finally. You know that. Yes, Lydia said. I know. Margaret was harder on her than on anyone else. She was not cruel about it. Cruelty would have been easier to deal with. She was precise. She found, with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention her whole life, the exact things Lydia cared about and asked careful questions about them. She asked about Lydia's background in a tone that was polite and thorough. She asked about Lydia's late husband. What had he done? How had he died? What had she done after? She observed Lydia with the twins with the focused attention of a woman who had opinions about how babies should be held and was cataloging whether Lydia's way measured up. On the second day, she found the quilt. It was in the storage room, Ruth's quilt, the one Gideon had told her about the first week, a large pieced quilt in blues and greens that Ruth had made before the babies came. Lydia had found it early on and had put it in the storage room carefully, folded right, because it was not her quilt and she wasn't going to use it. She'd been sleeping under her own blanket, the worn one from her traveling bag. Margaret came to the storage room doorway and saw the folded quilt and looked at Lydia and said, "You didn't use it." "It wasn't mine to use," Lydia said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that she controlled. "Ruth made that for the guest room," she said. "She would have expected it to be used." "Maybe so," Lydia said, "but I didn't know that. And when I don't know something like that, I leave it alone." Margaret looked at her, really looked at her, the full, direct look of a woman who had been making assessments her whole life and knew it. Then she said, "My daughter was not easy to replace." "I'm not trying to replace her," Lydia said. "I'm trying to keep her children alive through the winter." The silence after that was long. "You're very certain of yourself," Margaret said. "Not always," Lydia said, "but about that, yes." Margaret left the doorway without another word. Lydia sat on the edge of the cot and breathed deliberately for a moment and thought about the sky she'd seen that morning, which had done something new and specific that she needed to talk to Gideon about, and thought about the fact that the conversation she needed to have about the storm was going to be more complicated now, with Margaret in the house and watching everything. She went and found Gideon in the barn. "It's coming faster than I thought," she said without greeting. He looked up from the harness he was mending. "How much faster?" "I don't know, 2 weeks, maybe less. The sky this morning?" "Margaret wants to leave Sunday," he said. "She wants to take the twins with her on the Sunday wagon." "Gideon?" "I know. Listen to me. The storm I've been telling you about, if the twins are on a wagon in open country when it hits, I said I know." He set the harness down. "I'm not letting her take them. I already told her no. She's..." He pressed his mouth together. "She's not accepting it. She's going to fight you on it. She's going to fight both of us on it." That phrasing, "both of us," landed somewhere specific inside her, and she made herself ignore it. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing. Stay out of it. If she's planning to leave Sunday with the babies, I said I'm handling it." He picked up the harness again. "Let me handle one thing, Lydia." She heard her name. He used it occasionally now without noticing he was doing it. "All right," she said. She went back to the cabin and she started on the emergency feed calculations because the storm preparation couldn't wait for the family drama to resolve itself. And that was the truest thing about the situation. The storm didn't care about any of it. It didn't care about Margaret's grief or Gideon's authority or Lydia's careful position in a house that wasn't hers. It was coming regardless, at the speed it chose, and everything else would have to arrange itself around that fact. She was at the table with the feed numbers when Margaret came in from the yard and stopped and looked at what she was doing. "What is that?" Margaret said. "Feed calculations, emergency reserves for if we're snowed in longer than expected." "You're planning for an extended storm?" "Yes." Margaret came closer and looked at the numbers. She was silent for a moment. "Gideon mentioned you think this winter will be severe." "I do." "The ranchers in town don't share that assessment." "I know." "You've been here, what, 2 months?" 2 months and a week," Lydia said. And you believe you can read this valley's weather better than men who've lived here for decades. She said it without venom. That was the thing about Margaret. She wasn't vicious. She was sharp. There was a difference, and the difference mattered because it meant the conversation had to be taken seriously. I believe the signs are what they are, Lydia said, regardless of who reads them. And I believe that if I'm wrong, the cost is extra feed we don't need. And if I'm right and we're not prepared, the cost is considerably higher. Margaret looked at her again in that direct way. And the ropes? Guide ropes. Between the buildings. So a person doesn't get lost in a whiteout. Gideon strung them? We strung them together. Margaret sat down, which surprised Lydia. She hadn't expected her to sit. She sat in Gideon's chair and folded her hands on the table and said, "My daughter was afraid of this place. Did you know that? Not the work. She wasn't afraid of work, but the isolation, the winter. She used to write to me about it." Lydia set down her pencil. "She said the winter felt like being buried alive," Margaret said. "She said Gideon didn't understand it because he'd been here his whole life and couldn't see it." She paused. "She was 3 months pregnant when the last letter came. She talked about the spring. She was planning the garden." "I'm sorry," Lydia said. She meant it the same way she'd meant it when she'd said it to Gideon, simply without trying to fill the space around it. "She would have gotten better at the winter," Margaret said. "She would have learned." "I think so too," Lydia said. "You're learning it differently than she would have." "Probably. That's not a criticism." Margaret looked at the calculations on the table. "You actually believe the storm is coming." "I believe it completely," Lydia said. Another silence. Margaret was doing something, calculating, assessing, the same internal process that Lydia had watched Gideon go through, but quicker, and with a different quality to it, the quality of someone who had been good at reading people for a long time and didn't always like what they read. "If you're right," she said, "then the twins shouldn't travel on Sunday." "No," Lydia said, "they shouldn't." "You should have said that directly instead of letting Gideon fight with me about it." "It wasn't my place to say it directly to you." "Why not?" "Because you came here for your grandchildren, and that's right. And because your opinion of me was already decided before you got here, and adding my voice to the argument would have made Gideon's position harder, not easier." Margaret stared at her. Then slowly she said, "You're shrewder than you appear." "I appear however I appear," Lydia said. "I'm just practical." Gideon came in from the barn 20 minutes later to find the two of them at the table, Lydia with her calculations and Margaret reading them with her glasses on, asking questions in the precise, unsentimental way of a woman who had run a household on a tight budget for 40 years and understood numbers better than she'd been given credit for. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the scene, and then looked at Lydia with an expression she couldn't read at all. She picked up her pencil and kept working. The fight happened that night. Not between Gideon and Margaret. That one had already happened, or enough of it had. The fight happened between Gideon and Lydia in the cold of the yard after supper, when Margaret was inside with the babies, and the lamp was lit in the window, and the sky above them was doing the thing she'd been watching it do for days, that purposeful, heavy settling. She had pushed too hard on the emergency livestock shelter. She knew she'd pushed too hard. She'd laid out the full case for it, the design, the materials needed, the time it would take, what it would cost, and she'd done it at the wrong moment, when Gideon was already stretched between Margaret and the babies and the ranch, and she'd added one more thing, and it had come out wrong. "You can't keep doing this," he said. Outside, his voice was lower but sharper. "Every time I think I have a grip on something, you come with another thing I haven't done and should have done and need to do immediately. The shelter is necessary. Maybe it is, but you don't—" He stopped, looked at the ground. "You don't ask, Lydia. You tell. And I've been going along with most of it because most of it has been right. But this is still my ranch." She felt the fairness in it land before she could protect against it. He wasn't wrong. She'd been pushing the urgency so hard that she'd stopped framing things as suggestions and started framing them as conclusions. And there was a difference, even when the conclusions were right. "You're right," she said. He looked up. "I should have asked. I've been—" She searched for the word. "I've been afraid that if I slow down to ask, the time runs out. and I make the asking feel like telling. I know I do that." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind came up and moved her hair across her face, and she pushed it back. "How much time do you actually think we have?" he said. "For the shelter? A week, maybe slightly more. And if we don't build it, we lose calves, possibly cows. If the storm is as bad as I think, possibly most of the herd." He looked at the sky. She watched him look at it, watched him trying to see what she saw, and she could tell he was getting closer to it, that he was starting to read the same thing she was reading, even if he didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. "I'll help build it," he said. "Ask me next time." "I'll ask," she said. They stood in the yard for a moment, not moving, the lamp burning in the window behind them, the sky pressing down above them. "She's not going to take them," he said. It was not about the shelter. "I know," Lydia said, "but she's not going to leave either. Not until she's decided about you." "What does she need to decide?" He looked at her steadily. "Whether you're here for the ranch," he said, "or for something else." The wind moved again. She held very still. "And what do you think?" she said. He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable. "I think," he said, "that I'm not ready to answer that question yet." He went inside. She stayed in the yard for another minute, looking at the sky, and the sky looked back at her with all its flat, determined weight, and she thought, "It's coming, sooner than a week, 5 days, maybe 4. She thought about the guide ropes and the nursery insulation and the feed reserves and the livestock shelter they hadn't built yet, and she thought about Margaret inside making her assessment, and Gideon inside not answering a question she hadn't quite asked, and the twins behind their curtain breathing in the warm dark. She had been in this valley for just over 2 months. She had nowhere else to go, and she had stopped minding that, which was its own kind of dangerous thing to notice. She went inside and sat down at the table and picked up her pencil. The shelter needed to be started in the morning. They started the livestock shelter the next morning before the sun was fully up. Gideon had been out to the barn before Lydia even came out of the storage room, which told her he'd been lying awake thinking about it. She found him already moving lumber when she came outside, his breath coming in hard white clouds in the cold, and she didn't say anything about the fact that he'd started without being asked again. She just picked up the other end of the beam he was positioning and helped him set it. They worked without talking much for the first 2 hours. Margaret came out once to watch, standing at the cabin door with her coat pulled tight, and then went back inside without comment. The work itself had a clarifying quality. When 2 people are doing something physically demanding together, there isn't room for the complicated things to take up space. You're just lifting or nailing or measuring or holding, and the other person is on the other end of it, and that's sufficient. By mid-morning, they had the frame up. It wasn't elegant. Lydia had designed it for function, not appearance. A 3-sided structure with a slanted roof that would direct snow off rather than let it accumulate and collapse the whole thing, positioned against the south side of the main barn where it would get what little winter sun there was. The south side mattered. She'd been deliberate about that. "You designed this before you asked me about it," Gideon said, without accusation. He was looking at the way the pieces fit together. "Yes," she said. "How long ago?" 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment, driving a nail. 3 weeks. I was waiting for the right time to bring it up. While knowing the right time was running out. Yes. He drove another nail. I'm not sure if that's patient or stubborn. Probably both, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but in that direction, and it came and went quickly the way things did with him, like he was still in the habit of putting a lid on anything that looked too much like ease. By afternoon, the outer walls were going up and the wind had changed direction, which Lydia noticed immediately and did not like. A west wind was expected. This had shifted north. She stopped what she was doing and stood still for a moment with her face turned into it. What? Gideon said. He'd learned to read her pauses. Wind shifted north. He turned into it too, felt it. Is that? It's earlier than I thought, she said. We need to finish this today. We can't finish this today. We'd need to, I know what we'd need. Can we do it? He looked at the structure, calculating. If Margaret helps with the smaller pieces, ask her, Lydia said. She'll say yes. He looked at her. She's not fragile, Lydia said, and she wants to be useful. Ask her. He went and asked. Margaret came out in her coat and her good boots and did not complain about either the cold or the work, and Lydia revised something in her assessment of the woman. She had already known Margaret was sharp, but sharp people weren't always willing to pick up the less dignified end of a piece of timber. Margaret was. She worked with the competence of someone who had done hard work before and still remembered how. They finished the shelter frame at dusk. Not the full interior, there wasn't time, but the frame and the roof and the walls, enough to provide meaningful protection. They drove the last nails in the dark, working by lantern light, and when it was done, the three of them stood there breathing hard, and Gideon looked at the structure and said, "It's going to hold." "Yes," Lydia said, "it is." Margaret beside her said nothing, but when they walked back to the cabin, she walked next to Lydia, not behind her. The storm came 4 days later. Lydia knew it was coming the night before by the silence. People didn't talk about the silence before a major storm, but that was always how she'd known. The way the wind dropped to almost nothing, and the animals got very still, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath in a way that was not peaceful, but anticipatory. She sat up until midnight checking everything she could check: feed reserves, water, the nursery insulation, the guide ropes. She went outside in the dark and walked each rope line herself, pulling on them, testing the knots. The cold by then was the kind that got into your sinuses and made your eyes water. She came back in and Gideon was awake, sitting at the table. "You checked the ropes," he said. "Yes." "They're good. I checked them yesterday." "I know, I checked them again." She sat down across from him. "Tomorrow," she said. "It's coming tomorrow." He looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was all shadows and angles, and she could see he was taking her word for it now, completely, without the careful reserve he'd had before. That had shifted somewhere in the last weeks without either of them marking the exact moment. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know exactly. Bad. We've done everything we can do?" "Yes." "Then we wait." "Then we wait," she said. He got up and poured 2 cups of coffee, which he'd never done before. She was always the one who poured. And he set one in front of her and sat back down, and they sat there in the lamplight with the unnatural silence outside pressing against the walls. And she thought, "This is the strangest situation I have ever been in, and I am more at peace in it than I have been in years." And she did not say that out loud because there was no version of saying it that didn't open a door she wasn't sure should be opened yet. "If it's as bad as you think," Gideon said, "and the other ranches aren't ready, there's nothing we can do about that now. Caleb Mercer has a family. Caleb Mercer had the same sky we had. He had the same cold and the same signs, and he made his choice." She paused. "That's not cruelty. That's just how it is." "I know," he said. I know," she said. Margaret appeared in the doorway of the back room where she'd been sleeping. Lydia had moved to a corner pallet to give her the cot, and looked at the two of them, and looked at the window. "It's coming," she said. Not a question. "Tomorrow," Lydia said. Margaret came and sat down at the table without being invited, which by this point seemed natural, and Lydia poured her a cup too. The three of them sat in the kitchen while the unnatural calm held outside, and somewhere behind the curtain James made a small sound in his sleep and then went quiet. "Ruth used to say the silence before a storm sounded like the world forgetting to breathe," Margaret said. She said it quietly, not for effect, just the way you say a thing that comes to mind. "That's exactly what it is," Lydia said. Margaret looked at her. "She would have liked you," she said. "I've been trying not to think that, but it's true." Lydia didn't know what to do with that. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that might break if you grip it too hard. And she said, "That means something to me." "I imagine it does," Margaret said, and drank her coffee. The storm hit at noon the next day, and it hit like a wall. Lydia had been through bad storms. She had been through the 1887 winter in Montana that she'd told Gideon about, huddled in a 2-room house with her husband and not enough firewood, watching cattle die in the field because there was nothing to be done. She thought she knew what bad looked like. This was worse than what she'd expected, and she had expected something severe. The wind was the thing. Snow you could plan for, but the wind that came with this storm was the kind that turned solid walls of snow sideways and made sound itself seem to break apart. It hit the cabin like a repeated blow, steady and enormous. And the first thing Lydia did when it started was go to the nursery corner and check the insulation with her hands, pressing on the walls, feeling for cold seeping through. And it held. The temperature inside that corner stayed measurably warmer than the rest of the room. She put her palm flat on the wall above the babies' heads and felt nothing but the wool and hay doing exactly what she'd designed it to do. "They're warm," she told Gideon, who had come to stand behind her. He reached past her and put his own hand on the wall. She felt the sleeve of his coat brush her arm. "Yes," he said, "they are." He went to check the animals. That was the arrangement. She managed the inside, he managed the outside. And he suited up with everything available, layers and more layers. His coat over a second coat, and she handed him the leather gloves she'd reinforced with wool batting inside because his own gloves weren't thick enough, and she'd done that 2 weeks ago without telling him. And he'd found them one morning and not said anything about it, but worn them every day since. He put his hand on his guide rope outside the door, and she watched him from the window, a dark shape bending against the white chaos, moving hand over hand along the rope toward the barn, and she felt something in her chest that was not comfortable to feel. The specific fear of watching someone you've started to care about go into something dangerous that you can't follow them into. She watched until he disappeared into the barn. She turned around. Margaret was there. "He'll be fine," Margaret said. "I know," Lydia said. She went to check the water supply. Gideon came back from the barn and went again, and came back and went again. 3 times in the first 6 hours. Each time carrying hay, and each time returning to the rope hand over hand and coming through the door with ice in his eyebrows and his face red from the cold and his breathing loud and effortful. Each time he came back, Lydia had something hot waiting, coffee, broth, whatever was on the stove, and each time he drank it standing up and went back out. And she stopped herself from telling him to be careful because it wasn't useful, and he knew the risks, and she was not his mother. The roof held. She'd worried about the roof. There was one section on the east side where she'd noticed the boards weren't tight enough, and she'd raised it with Gideon back in October, and he'd reinforced it, and she'd looked at his work and thought it was probably sufficient, and hoped she was right. The snow loaded onto the roof, and the east section groaned once, a single deep creak that made all 3 adults look up at the same moment, and then it settled and held. "That was the east section," Gideon said. "I know. It held." "You were worried about it." "Yes, it held anyway." He looked at the ceiling for another moment. "You're allowed to be right without being graceful about it, you know. Most people would say I told you so." "Most people would," she agreed. By late afternoon, the storm had reached something beyond what Lydia had seen before, even in 1887, and she was forced to admit to herself, in the private part of her mind where she kept her honest assessments, that she had underestimated it. Not in her preparations, the preparations were right, more right than she'd known when she made them, but in the raw scale of what this storm was doing. The wind had gotten louder. She hadn't known wind could get louder once it reached a certain point. It was a constant roar now, steady and enormous, and underneath it you could hear the specific sounds of things under stress. The barn, the smaller outbuilding, the new livestock shelter that had been standing for 4 days. "The shelter," Gideon said, at the same moment she was thinking it. "It's built right," she said. "It'll hold." "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself." "I'm trying to convince both of us," she said honestly. Clara started crying, then James. The particular synchrony of twins distressing each other. One crying wakes the other's crying feeds the first, and suddenly you have 2 alarms going at full volume and no easy solution. Margaret went to James, Lydia went to Clara, and they worked in the warm corner for 20 minutes until both babies were calm again. And by the time it was done, Lydia was aware of something she hadn't been aware of before, that she and Margaret had just managed a crisis together, in the same space, with the same goal, without discussing it or dividing the labor out loud. It had just happened, the way things happen when 2 people are finally trying for the same thing. She caught Margaret's eye across the sleeping babies. "Clara takes longer to settle when she's frightened," Margaret said quietly. "Not criticism, observation." "Yes," Lydia said. "She's more sensitive to sound than James is." Ruth was the same way. Lydia held very still. "As a baby," Margaret said. She startled at everything. She looked down at Clara. "She has Ruth's hands," she said. "I noticed it the first day." "Yes," Lydia said. "They're beautiful hands." Margaret straightened up. She looked at Lydia with the direct look that Lydia had come to understand was simply how Margaret saw. She didn't look sideways at things, didn't soften her focus. "You're not trying to be her mother," she said. "I can see that now. It took me longer than it should have." "You were protecting her memory," Lydia said. "That's right." "It's also possible," Margaret said, "to protect a memory and still let living things grow." She went back to the table. Lydia stayed with Clara for another moment, and the wind roared outside and the cabin held around them, and she pressed her hand once, gently, against the insulated wall, and felt it, still warm, still working. The knock came at 3 in the morning, and it took Lydia a moment to understand what she was hearing, because a knock implied someone outside, and someone outside in this storm implied something had gone badly wrong. Gideon was up before her, already at the door. It was a boy, maybe 16, maybe younger, impossible to tell under the ice and the layers, barely able to stand, one hand gripping the guide rope post that extended from the corner of their cabin. He was from the Mercer Ranch. He could barely get the words out, but he got them out. His father had gone to the barn 4 hours ago and hadn't come back. "Caleb went out without a rope," Gideon said, already pulling on layers. "I'm coming with you," Lydia said. "No. You need 2 people. One holds the rope, one searches. You know that." He looked at her, and she looked back, and he said, "Margaret." "I'm awake," Margaret said from behind them. "Go. I have the children." They went. The cold outside was something Lydia felt as a physical assault, not just on her skin, but on her ability to think clearly, the way extreme cold reduces everything to the most basic functions. She gripped the guide rope with both hands, and they moved together away from the cabin toward the edge of their property, and beyond the guide rope there was nothing, no visibility, no landmarks, just white chaos and the roar of the wind that made speech almost impossible. "He could be anywhere," Gideon shouted over the wind. "He'll have gone toward shelter, not toward the open. He'd go toward something solid." She scanned what she could see, which was almost nothing. "Your fence line, the east fence. If he walked into it, he'd follow it." She felt him make the decision. She could feel it in the rope, the direction of his weight, and they moved east, both hands on the line, leaning into the wind. She kept her eyes moving even though there was almost nothing to see. She thought about the specific way a lost person moved in a whiteout. They curved. It was a known thing, a documented phenomenon. Without visual reference, a person walking in a straight line would gradually curve right, most of the time, and eventually circle back without knowing it. If Caleb had gone out 4 hours ago and curved right, and if he'd hit the fence line, there! She saw him before Gideon did. A shape against the fence, dark against the white, not moving. They got to him together, and he was alive, barely, hunched against a fence post with his arms crossed over his chest and his eyes half open, and the particular gray pallor that meant his body had given up trying to stay warm and had started doing something else instead. Getting him back was the hardest physical thing Lydia had done in years. He was large, unconscious by the time they reached him, and the wind was directly against them on the return. Gideon took most of the weight, and she kept her hand on the guide rope, and they moved in short stages, 10 feet, stop, breathe, 10 more feet. And she talked the whole way, not to Caleb, but to Gideon, just words, just come on, and 10 more feet, and hold on. And she wasn't sure he could even hear her over the wind, but she kept talking because it was all she had to offer. They got him through the door. Margaret had the fire built up already. She'd seen them go and understood what they might be bringing back. And blankets on the floor in front of it, and she didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, just got down on the floor next to Caleb Mercer and started working on his hands and feet with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who'd helped people through hard things before and wasn't squeamish about it. The boy, Caleb's son, whose name turned out to be Thomas, sat in the corner with his own blanket and watched his father with the specific terrified stillness of a child who has understood for the first time that his father can be lost. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of warming him slowly, carefully, not too fast, that was the danger. Warming too fast when someone had gotten that cold could do its own damage. and talking to him when he was coherent enough to respond, which wasn't often at first. Lydia monitored his breathing and his color and the temperature of his extremities, and kept up a running quiet assessment in her head of whether he was coming back or not. He came back. The moment she was sure of it was when he looked at Gideon and said, his voice cracked and rough, "You strung ropes." "Yes," Gideon said. "Couldn't have found the door without them." He swallowed. "Didn't have my own." "No," Gideon said. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. "Whose idea?" Gideon looked at Lydia. "Hers," he said. Caleb turned his head to look at her. His face was still gray, but his eyes were clearer. She looked back at him and didn't say anything. "I told you hay walls were foolish," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." "Was wrong." "Yes," she said. "You were." His mouth moved in something that might have been the beginning of a smile if he'd had the energy for a full one. "You're not generous about it," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." He closed his eyes again. His breathing was steadier now. His son crossed the room and sat down next to him on the floor, and Caleb put a hand on the boy's arm without opening his eyes. Lydia stood up from the floor, and her knees hurt and her hands were still cold from outside, and she was aware of being very tired in the specific way that comes after something has been resolved that might not have been. She went to the window and looked out at the storm, which had not let up. It didn't care that Caleb Mercer was alive, didn't care that the guide rope had worked, didn't care about any of it. It was doing what it was doing, at the scale it had chosen, and they were all just working with what they had inside the space it allowed them. She felt Gideon before she heard him. He came up beside her and stood at the window and looked out at the same white chaos. "The shelter's holding," he said. "I checked when we came back in. Can hear the cattle." "Good." The newborn calf, the one from Tuesday, she was close to the south wall. Warmest spot. That's why I positioned it that way. "I know." They stood there together at the window. She was aware of him in the way she'd been carefully not being aware of him for weeks. The specific, inconvenient, undeniable awareness of someone standing very close to you whom you've stopped pretending is simply a professional arrangement. "When I was out there," he said, "when we were coming back with Caleb, I was holding the rope and I could hear you talking. I wasn't sure you could hear me. I couldn't always make out the words, but the sound of it..." He stopped. "I just needed to hear you talking." She looked at the window, at the white that went on in every direction. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's not the right time. I just wanted to say it." She breathed in slowly. "All right," she said. "All right, it's not the right time," or, "All right, I heard you," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "That's what I mean." They stayed at the window until the lamp burned low, and outside the storm went on with its enormous, indifferent roar, and inside the cabin Caleb Mercer breathed steadily by the fire, and his son slept next to him, and Margaret kept watch over the twins, and the walls held, and the ropes held, and the insulation held, and every single thing that Lydia Rowan had built against the dark held through the night and into the gray, exhausted, still storming morning. She didn't sleep. She sat in the chair by the fire and watched the light change through the window and kept her hand on the wall above where the babies slept, checking the warmth, and she thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way you do when something very large has just been survived, and you don't yet know what comes next. The storm raged on, but inside that cabin, everything that mattered was still alive. The storm broke on the third day. Not dramatically, not the way storms broke in the stories people told afterward, with sudden light and a feeling of relief so clean it almost hurt. It broke the way most hard things end, which is gradually and without announcement. The wind dropped by degrees through the morning, and the snow thinned from a wall to a curtain to a slow, quiet fall. And by early afternoon there was actual sky visible in the northwest. Pale gray, not blue yet, but sky. Actual sky with depth to it instead of the flat white nothing that had pressed against the windows for 60 hours. Lydia stood at the window and watched the sky appear and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something up through an act of sustained will and can finally, incrementally, let it down. Caleb Mercer was alive. He was sitting at the table which he'd graduated to from the floor sometime in the second night, and he was eating, slowly, carefully, with the deliberate attention of a man whose body was still making decisions about what it wanted to accept. But he was eating. His color was better. His hands, which had been the thing Lydia had worried most about, had feeling in them by the second morning, and he'd spent an hour flexing his fingers with focused, grim determination, and she'd watched it and not said anything about the fact that he'd nearly lost them. His son Thomas had barely left his side in 3 days. He was a quiet boy, not the kind that talked to fill space, and the two of them, father and son, communicated mostly in short exchanges and long silences that somehow didn't seem uncomfortable. Lydia noticed that Caleb looked at the boy differently than he had when they'd arrived. Or maybe he'd always looked at him like that, and the storm had just stripped away whatever he used to cover it. "I should get back," Caleb said, on the afternoon the sky cleared. "My wife doesn't know." "The road won't be passable until tomorrow," Lydia said. "The drifts in the low sections are going to be deep." "I know the road." "I know you do. It still won't be passable until tomorrow." He looked at her with the expression she'd seen on his face since he'd been well enough to have expressions. Not quite the contempt from the feed store, but something that was working through what to replace that contempt with, like a man rearranging furniture in a room that had been set up wrong for a long time. "You always this direct?" he said. "Usually," she said. "Must make things complicated." "Frequently," she agreed. Something in his face shifted, not a smile, not quite, but in that vicinity. "Gideon told me about the hay walls," he said, "on the barn. They worked. He said the cattle came through better than they should have." "They did." "And the calf." "She's fine. I checked this morning." Caleb was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I've been ranching that valley for 22 years, he said. Not the way he'd said it in the feed store, not with the authority of a man establishing territory. Just a fact now. "Never thought about hay walls." "Nobody thinks about what they don't think about," she said. "That's the nature of it." "That's a very polite way of saying I was wrong." "You were wrong," she said. "You were also the one who came out in the storm to find your father," she added, looking at Thomas. "And that took more than most boys that age have." Thomas looked up. He hadn't expected to be spoken to, and he didn't quite know what to do with it, which was very much a 16-year-old thing, and he looked at his father, and Caleb looked at his son, and something passed between them that was private, and Lydia looked away. Gideon went out to assess the damage the morning after the sky cleared, and Lydia went with him because there were things she needed to see for herself. The world outside the cabin was unrecognizable. That was the only word for it. The drifts had remade the landscape, and familiar distances had become something else entirely. The fence line on the east side was buried to the top rail in 2 places. The smaller outbuilding had shed a section of roof under the snow load, which was fixable but would need to be addressed before the next weather. The main barn had held completely. The livestock shelter had held completely. They stood in front of the livestock shelter and looked at it together. It was not beautiful. It had been built fast with whatever was available, and it showed. But everything inside it was alive, the cattle moving and vocal in the particular way of animals that have been confined too long and are ready to be otherwise. And the newborn calf was standing on her own 4 legs in the warmest corner exactly where Lydia had positioned it. "She's standing," Gideon said. "She is." He turned and looked at Lydia. He had snow on his coat, and his face was red from the cold, and he hadn't shaved in 4 days, and he looked at her with something she'd been watching build for weeks without letting herself name it. "How much of this valley would have survived without what you did?" he said. "Don't," she said. "I'm not flattering you." "I know. Don't anyway." She looked at the calf. "We don't know yet what the rest of the valley looks like. Some of it will be bad." "Caleb's ranch?" "Probably lost animals. Maybe a structure. He wasn't ready." She paused. "That's not my success. That's just the difference between prepared and unprepared." "You prepared us." "You let me," she said. "That's not nothing. Plenty of men wouldn't have." He was looking at her in the way she'd gotten better at looking back at without feeling like she needed to look away. "When we were out there," he said, "bringing Caleb back, when I couldn't see anything." Gideon, let me say it. She waited. When I couldn't see anything, and I couldn't hear anything except the wind, and then I heard your voice. He stopped, looked at the shelter, looked back at her. I knew where I was. That's all I'm saying. I knew where I was because I could hear you. She breathed carefully. The cold air was sharp in her lungs. That's not nothing either, she said. He nodded once. Then he went to check the fence line, and she went back to the cabin, and neither of them pushed it further, which was right. There was too much still unresolved, too much still settling, and she'd learned in her life that the most fragile moments were the ones right after something big, when everything feels possible, and that feeling can lead you into rushing something that needs more time than the feeling allows. She was patient. She had gotten good at patient. Lydia. Caleb left the next morning with Thomas, on horses because the wagon road was still impassable. Before he went, he stood in the yard and looked at the guide ropes with an expression that was somewhere between embarrassed and something deeper than embarrassed. The expression of a man confronting a specific, costly error and knowing there's no way around it, only through it. These ropes, he said, I would have been dead without them. Yes, Lydia said. She had decided somewhere in the last 3 days that she was going to let Caleb Mercer have his reckoning without softening it for him, because softening it wouldn't serve him. Sometimes the honest weight of a thing was the only way it changed you. My wife is going to want to know what happened, he said. I'm going to have to tell her that a woman I dismissed in a feed store is the reason I came home. Tell her whatever you need to tell her, Lydia said. I'll tell her the truth. He looked at her directly. I owe you that, at minimum. You owe me nothing, she said. Just, if your neighbor comes to you next time with an idea that sounds strange, consider it before you decide it's foolish. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, Yes, ma'am, and meant it without irony, which was more than she'd expected from him, and she accepted it with a nod. Gideon shook his hand. Thomas shook Gideon's hand and then, unexpectedly, shook Lydia's. Formally, with both hands, the handshake of someone who had just learned something about what it meant to be grateful. She watched them go and stood in the cold until they were out of sight, and then went back inside because there was work to do. There was always work to do. That was not a complaint. It was just the shape of life in that place, and she had made her peace with it so completely that she no longer distinguished between it and herself. Margaret was the harder goodbye to anticipate, and it did not go the way Lydia expected. She'd been preparing herself, in the pragmatic way she prepared for most things, for a conversation in which Margaret stated her conclusions about the situation. Probably something measured, probably something that acknowledged Lydia's competence, while still asserting the primacy of her own grief and her rights as the children's grandmother. Lydia had her responses ready. She'd had them ready for days. What she had not prepared for was Margaret coming into the storage room the night before she was supposed to leave and sitting down on the cot, Lydia's cot, the one in the room that still held traces of Ruth in the way the room was arranged, and simply being there for a moment without starting. Lydia sat down next to her and waited. I went through everything wrong from the beginning, Margaret said finally. I came here with a conclusion already made. You came here to protect your grandchildren, Lydia said. That wasn't wrong. My method was wrong. Margaret looked at her hands. They were strong hands, working hands, the hands of a woman who had never had the luxury of being delicate about things. I wanted you to be a threat because that would have made it simple, a threat I could remove, a problem I could solve by taking the children to Cheyenne. And now? Now I can see you clearly. She looked up. What you did for those children, what you've been doing since before I arrived, the insulation, the feeding schedule, the way you held Clara when she was afraid during the storm, that's not a woman filling a vacancy. That's a woman who has chosen something. Lydia felt the truth of it land without trying to deflect it. Ruth is still here, Margaret said. I need you to know that I can see that. Her quilts. The way you organized her kitchen, same categories you told Gideon, just different order. You didn't touch the things on the shelf she kept her sewing on. I didn't know what they meant, so I left them. I know. Margaret pressed her lips together for a moment. That's the thing I keep coming back to. When you don't know, you leave it alone. That's... She stopped. Ruth was impulsive, beautiful, but impulsive. She would have changed everything her first week. A pause. I say that with love. I know you do, Lydia said. You're different. Not better. I won't say that, it wouldn't be true and it wouldn't be fair. Different. And Gideon needs different now. The room was quiet. The wind outside was gentle now, nothing like what it had been, just the ordinary ambient sound of winter. He hasn't said anything to me, Lydia said carefully. Not directly. He will, Margaret said. He's slow about the things that matter most to him. He was slow to tell Ruth, too. She had to ask him directly, which she told me about and which he doesn't know I know. She almost smiled. Don't make him wait too long. Margaret, Lydia said, I'm not matchmaking. I'm just... She searched for the word. I'm giving you what I have to give you, which is my honest assessment and my blessing, for whatever my blessing is worth to you. Lydia sat with that for a moment. It was worth more than she could easily say, and she suspected Margaret knew that. It's worth a great deal, she said. Margaret nodded once, the way people nod when they've said the thing they came to say and don't need to elaborate on it. I'm going to Cheyenne tomorrow, she said, without the twins. A pause. They belong here. I knew that before I came. I just needed to see it with my own eyes. Come back in the spring, Lydia said. When the road is good, come and spend time with them. Margaret looked at her. You mean that? I mean it completely, Lydia said. They should know you. They should know everything you carry of Ruth. That's not separate from what this family is. It's part of it. Something in Margaret's face shifted then, not dramatically, but deeply. The kind of shift that happens when a person has been braced against something for a long time and realizes they don't have to be braced anymore. She stood up. She was not a woman who cried in front of people. Lydia could see that, and she wasn't crying now, but the effort of not doing it was present in the set of her jaw, and Lydia respected that and said nothing. Spring, Margaret said. Spring, Lydia confirmed. Margaret went to bed. Lydia sat in the storage room for a long time and looked at the wall and thought about how strange it was, the way life moved. How you could spend years going in one direction and then one storm, one wrong turn, one lame horse in the late afternoon could put you somewhere completely different, and the somewhere completely different could turn out to be the place you'd been trying to get to without knowing it. She didn't think she was a sentimental woman. She had not been able to afford sentimentality in her life. It cost too much and paid back in currency she couldn't spend. But sitting in that room, with the storm finally gone and the twins breathing behind their curtain and Margaret's words still present in the air, she felt something that she didn't have a better word for than grateful. Not to anyone or anything in particular, just grateful that the horse had been lame. Grateful that she'd turned toward the smoke. Margaret left the next morning with the hired wagon that Gideon arranged, and the goodbye with the twins was long and unashamed. She held each of them for a full 5 minutes, talking to them in a quiet voice that was private, not for anyone else. And Lydia kept her distance and found things to do at the stove that didn't need doing. And Gideon stood near the door with the patience of a man who understood that this moment belonged to Margaret completely. When she finally handed James to Lydia, not to Gideon, to Lydia, with a deliberateness that couldn't be accidental, she held Lydia's gaze for a moment and then hugged her. It was brief and firm and real. Then she got into the wagon and didn't look back. Gideon watched the wagon until it was gone. Then he came inside and stood in the kitchen and seemed to not quite know what to do with himself, which happened to him sometimes in the aftermath of things. He'd been the kind of contained throughout the storm and Margaret's visit that some people are through hard things, holding himself in. And now that there was nothing specifically requiring it, the holding had nowhere to go. She's going to be all right, Lydia said. I know, he said. I'm not worried about Margaret. He stopped. She's the most capable person I've ever met, except maybe you. Lydia set James down in the cradle. She said something similar about you once. When? Early on, she said you were slow about the things that mattered most. She kept her back to him. She said it as a fact, not a criticism. The room was quiet. She wasn't wrong, he said. No, Lydia agreed. She wasn't. She heard him move, not toward her, but to the table, where he sat down in the way he sat when he was about to say something he'd been working up to. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him, because if this was the conversation she thought it was, she was going to have it facing him, not sideways. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that it's not because of the storm, or because Caleb owes us, or because the ranch is in better shape than it was. I need you to know that before I say it." "All right," she said, "I want you to stay." She waited, because she could tell he wasn't done. "Not the way you've been staying, not for room and board until spring." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to stay because this place is more itself when you're in it, and I'm more myself when you're in it. And I know you didn't come here for that, and I know I have no right to—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. "Ask me properly," she said. "I'm not a woman who accepts implications." Something moved through his face, relief possibly, or the specific expression of a man who has been given permission to be direct and finds it easier than the alternative. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not as help, as an equal," she said. "As an equal," he confirmed. "As a partner, in all of it, the ranch, the kids, He gestured at the room, at everything the room contained. All of it. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the cabin around her, the reorganized shelves, the curtained nursery, the guide rope coiled by the door, the crack in the north wall that had been re-chinked in October and had held through everything. She looked at the man across the table from her, who was not uncomplicated, who was not without grief, who was not going to be easy in all the ways she might have wished he'd be easy. She thought about the horse with the lame leg and the smoke on the horizon and the door opening and the particular disarray of a man trying to hold something together with his bare hands. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. Not the theatrical exhale of a man in a story, just air, just the release of something that had been held. "Okay," he said, quietly. "Okay." "You understand I'll still tell you when you're wrong," she said. "I know. And I'll still make changes without asking sometimes, when the time—" "Lydia," he said. "I know." She picked up a dish towel because her hands needed something to do. "All right then," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's it? What were you expecting?" "I don't know, something—" He shook his head. "More." "You asked, I answered. The rest of it—" She gestured in the same way he had. At everything, the whole of it. "The rest of it is just the work." He looked at her, and this time he did smile, fully, without putting a lid on it, the first time she'd seen him do that. And it changed his face considerably, and she found that she needed to look back at the dish towel for a moment. "The work," he repeated, like he was tasting the shape of the word. "Yes," she said, "which starts tomorrow. Because that section of the outbuilding roof isn't going to fix itself, and we've lost 3 days. He laughed. She hadn't heard him laugh before. A short, genuine sound, surprised out of him, and it was the best sound she'd heard in that cabin, possibly including the quiet of babies sleeping. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. Spring came late that year, the way it always did after a hard winter, tentative and then sudden. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first and then retreating faster than you expected, and the mud that followed was terrible and necessary, and the first green that came up through it was so specific and startling a color that it seemed almost aggressive after the months of white. The valley recovered. Not entirely and not without cost. 3 ranches in the lower part had lost significant livestock, and one family had lost a structure entirely that would need to be rebuilt in summer. But recovered in the sense that people were still there to do the recovering. Caleb Mercer's ranch had lost 11 cattle and part of a fence line, which was hard but survivable. And Caleb spent the first weeks of spring doing what Lydia had not expected him to do, visiting his neighbors. Not socially, practically. Arriving with his wagon and his tools and his son and spending the day helping repair what the storm had broken. He came to Iron Hollow in March, when the road was passable, with Thomas and 2 hired hands and an offer to help rebuild the outbuilding roof section that had collapsed under the snow. Gideon accepted, and Lydia made coffee and kept her distance, and midway through the morning, Caleb appeared at the cabin door and stood there until she acknowledged him. "I've been telling people about the hay walls," he said. "I heard," she said, "and the guide ropes." Dora Finch mentioned it. "I told them it was your idea, both things." He looked at her directly. "I told them they should have listened to you in October." She looked at him. "That can't have been comfortable to say." "No," he said. "It was not." He paused. "My wife wants to meet you. She said she wants to thank the woman who sent me home, and I couldn't talk her out of it." "Tell her she's welcome here any time," Lydia said. He nodded, turned to go. Then, without turning back, "You were right about the winter, about all of it." "I know," she said. "Does it ever get old? Being right when nobody believed you?" She thought about it honestly. "It gets old being in a position where you have to fight to be heard," she said. "Being right at the end of it doesn't make that part less exhausting." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair," he said. "That's fair." And he went back to the roof. It was a Tuesday in April when Clara said it. Lydia was at the table with James on her lap, pointing at things and naming them in the slow, patient way she'd started doing with both twins when they were awake and attentive, building the vocabulary that was starting to take hold in small, surprising ways. James had said something that resembled cow the week before, very possibly by accident, and Gideon had treated it with the grave seriousness of a man who had decided this was the most significant development of the year. Clara was in the corner with the wooden blocks that Gideon had made for them in February, arranging and demolishing them with the focused energy of a child who had discovered that she liked destroying things she'd built. She was a deliberate baby, more deliberate than James, and she worked at the blocks in silence with the concentration of someone filing something away. Lydia wasn't watching her. She was watching James point at the window and working on the word light, which he found interesting. And then Clara, still looking at her blocks, not looking up, said it. "Mama." Not to anyone in particular, not even clearly, the consonant still soft, the word shaped more than fully formed. But it was unmistakably the word. And then she said it again, this time looking up, looking at Lydia with the direct, uncomplicated certainty of a child who has decided something and is informing the nearest adult. "Mama." Lydia went very still. She was aware of the kitchen around her, the smell of the coffee she'd put on, the sound of Gideon coming in from outside, the creak of the door. She was aware of James on her lap, losing interest in the window and looking at his sister with the benign expression of a baby who wasn't entirely sure what was happening but was fine with it. She was aware of the specific, enormous, complicated feeling moving through her, the door in her chest that she had learned to keep closed, the one from before all of this, the one she'd lived beside for 2 years without opening it, swinging open now. Not because she'd chosen it, but because Clara was still looking at her and waiting with the patience of someone who had said a thing and wanted an acknowledgement. She heard Gideon stop, heard him understand. She looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her with those clear, serious eyes that were so distinctly her own, that were nobody else's eyes, that had been looking at Lydia with increasing recognition and trust for months. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. "I hear you." Clara picked up a block and put it on top of another block. Satisfied, apparently. Done with the announcement. Gideon came to sit across the table. He looked at her face, which she knew was not giving away nothing. She was better at controlled than she was at blank, and there was a difference. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the particular look of a man who understood what had just happened and was giving it the weight it deserved. "Don't," she said. "I'm fine." "I know you are," he said. "I wasn't going to." "I know you weren't," she breathed. "I know." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was the most direct thing he'd done in the weeks since the conversation in the kitchen. She didn't move her hand. She looked at the table and then at the babies and then at the window, where the April light was coming in at that long, slanted angle that meant the days were getting longer, that meant the ground outside was beginning to soften and turn and wake up again. "She's not wrong, you know," Gideon said quietly. "About the word." Lydia looked at him. "You've been..." He stopped, chose differently. You're who she reaches for when something hurts. You're who she looks for when she wakes up. That's not a position you applied for. That's just what happened. She thought about saying something practical. She thought about redirecting toward the work or the season or the outbuilding or any of the 100 things that needed doing. She was very good at that. She had been very good at that for years. Instead, she said, "She has Ruth's hands." Gideon went quiet. Not the quiet of pain, something steadier than that. "I know," he said. Margaret pointed it out. "I noticed the first week. I didn't say anything because you didn't know what it meant yet," he said. "Whether it was yours to say." "Yes." "Is it yours to say now?" She looked at Clara, who was building again, absorbed, unconcerned. She looked at James, who had fallen asleep against her with the sudden totality that infants fell asleep, one moment awake and the next simply not. She looked at Gideon, who was watching her with a patience that she recognized because she had seen it in the mirror her whole life. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." Nobody made a ceremony of anything. That was how Lydia wanted it, and Gideon understood that without being told. The ranch went into spring the way ranches went into spring, with an enormous amount of work that didn't pause for sentiment, and they did the work side by side, and the side by side became the rhythm of things, and the rhythm became the shape of the life. The arrangement they settled into was not simple and was not always easy. Gideon had moods, not dark, not dangerous, but closed sometimes, gone to some interior place that she'd learned not to follow him into uninvited, to wait near the door of until he came back. She had her own version, days when the loss she'd carried before this valley surfaced in ways she didn't always manage gracefully, when she was short with him in the morning or silent in the evening for reasons she couldn't fully explain. They were not each other's solutions. She had decided early on that two people being each other's solutions was a kind of trap, and she'd seen enough of that particular trap to know what it cost. But they were each other's constants. That was different, and it was enough. And on most days, it was more than enough. Margaret came in May, as promised, with a bag that was too large for a short visit, which made Gideon raise an eyebrow at Lydia, and Lydia shake her head very slightly in a way that meant leave it. She stayed 3 weeks. She sat with the twins for hours, telling them things about their mother in the particular cadence of storytelling. Not sad, mostly, just vivid, the way Ruth had laughed, the things she'd been afraid of, the things she'd been completely wrong about and funny in her wrongness. Lydia listened from across the room sometimes and didn't try to hide that she was listening, and Margaret knew and didn't stop. One evening toward the end of the visit, Margaret sat down next to Lydia on the porch steps after the twins were asleep, and they watched the last light go off the hills, and Margaret said, "She would have done this, eventually, figured out the winters, figured out the hay walls. She would have gotten there." "I believe you," Lydia said. "I need you to know that I know she would have been good at this," Margaret said. Not defensively, just clearly, like a fact that needed to be stated to stay real. "She raised a daughter like you," Lydia said. "She was clearly capable of most things." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that might have been a laugh, short, surprised, not her usual register. "That's either a compliment or an insult." "It's a compliment," Lydia said. "Entirely." Margaret put her hand over Lydia's on the step. It was the same brief, firm contact as the hug in the kitchen the morning she'd left. The same quality of a woman giving something she'd measured carefully and decided to give. Then she took her hand back, and they sat in the cooling evening and watched the hills go dark. Caleb's wife came in June. Her name was Vera, and she was smaller than Lydia had imagined, with a dry sense of humor and an appetite for coffee that rivaled Lydia's own, and she came with a pie and a direct question. "He told me," she said, over the coffee, while Gideon was outside with Caleb and the twins were asleep. "Everything, the feed store. What he said about the hay walls, how he behaved." "He didn't have to do that," Lydia said. "I know, he wanted to." Vera wrapped both hands around her cup. "He's not always like that. What he was like in October, he's... The valley does something to men sometimes. Makes them territorial about the knowledge. Like the knowing of how things work is a thing they own." "I've seen that before," Lydia said. "I imagine you have." Vera looked at her directly. He's different now, not completely. I don't want to overstate it, but the way he talked about you, after the storm, the way he talked about what you built here." She paused. "He doesn't talk about people that way often. He's a good man," Lydia said. "He was wrong and he knows he was wrong and he said so. That's more than most." "That's exactly what I told him," Vera said. "Almost exactly." She smiled. "I like you." "I like you too," Lydia said, and meant it, which surprised her a little, even now, how the valley kept offering her things she hadn't known she was going to want. It was a morning in late summer when Lydia stood at the north wall of the cabin and put her palm flat against the re-chinked section and felt it, solid. No cold seeping through. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the wall, not thinking anything in particular, just registering the solidity of it. She had been in this cabin for 9 months. She had arrived with $11 and a lame horse and nothing in particular to go to. She had stayed because there had been nowhere to go and because 2 babies needed someone to notice what was wrong and fix it. That was the honest account of the beginning, no more romantic than that. But the honest account of the present was different. The honest account of the present was that she knew where every pound of food was in this house, and which board on the south porch squeaked, and how long it took James to fall back asleep after a bad dream, and what Gideon's face looked like when he was worried about money and wouldn't say so yet. The honest account was that she had learned this place, and it had learned her back, in the way places do when you commit to them long enough to let them. She heard Clara behind her, awake early, padding across the floor in the way she padded, deliberate, purposeful. Even at this age she was purposeful. And she turned around and Clara looked up at her with those clear eyes and raised both arms in the universal request. And Lydia picked her up and settled her on her hip and said, "Good morning, you." And Clara put her head down on Lydia's shoulder like she'd been doing it for years. Because she had. 9 months, at that age, was years. Gideon came in from outside. He was always up before her now. A change from the early weeks, as though getting his mornings back had given him something he'd needed. He saw them at the window and didn't say anything. He went to the stove and started the coffee with the efficiency of a man who has made coffee in the same place for long enough that his hands know the task without his head being involved. "There's weather coming," he said without turning around. "Nothing serious," she said. "A few days of rain. The South Field needs it." "I know." A pause. "How do you know? There's no signs yet." "There are always signs," she said. "You just have to look for them." He turned then, and she saw the thing in his face that was ordinary now, the ease of a man in his own kitchen in the morning with someone he trusted. And she thought about the first morning she had sat across from him and made her case for staying, and he had looked at her with the exhausted wariness of a person who had learned that everything costs something. It still costs something. Everything still costs something. She had not found a version of life where that wasn't true, and she had stopped looking for one. But the thing you got in return for the cost, the solidity of the wall under her hand, the weight of Clara on her hip, the sound of James waking up behind his curtain, Gideon's face in the morning, was real in a way that other things she'd had hadn't been. Real in the way that only things built out of difficulty and honesty and time ever were. "Teach me," Gideon said. She looked at him. "What?" "How to read the signs, the weather, the animals. All of it." He was completely serious. "Teach me." She thought about it. Not whether she would, that was simple, but what it would mean. To teach someone to see the way you saw, to pass that on. "It takes time," she said. "We have time," he said. Clara, from Lydia's shoulder, said something that was not quite a word and not quite not one. Gideon looked at his daughter, and his expression did the thing she had come to love most about him. It opened, simply and completely, without reservation. "We have time," Lydia said. Outside, the summer morning was doing what summer mornings did in that valley, filling slowly with light from the east, gold and unhurried, falling across the hills and the fences and the guide ropes that were still strung between the buildings, because Lydia had decided to leave them, not because she expected another storm like that one, just because a thing that had already saved a life was worth keeping. The coffee was ready. The twins were waking. The work that needed doing was waiting with the patience of all the work that had ever waited, because it would still be there after breakfast, after the morning settling, after all the small necessary things that were not dramatic, and were not remarkable and were, she had come to understand, the whole of what a life was made of. She set Clara down, poured the coffee, sat across from Gideon in the chair that was her chair now, that held the particular impression of her particular way of sitting, and put both hands around the cup. The frontier had not gotten easier. The winters would come again. The work would be hard and the money would be tight, and there would be days when the distance between people and everything that could go wrong felt very small. But the family inside that cabin had become something that the winter had tested and had not broken, and would test again and would not break, not because they were exceptional, not because they were without fault, but because they had learned, slowly, honestly, at considerable cost, to hold together instead of apart. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.